Today's little parenting thingy. I do a parenting thingy at the beginning of each show. And what I'm going to talk about today is the four styles of parenting. There are four types, and this was originally formulated by Diane Baumrind. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the 1960s. And there's authoritarian or disciplinarian. So that's what most super religious households are going to be like. Permissive or indulgent, so a little too letting kids do what they want to do. Uninvolved and authoritative, which is what research has shown again and again to be the very best way to parent children. What are they? What do these mean? And see if you recognize yourself in some of these. By the way, nobody fits neatly into any one of these boxes. If you are a pure authoritative parent, good on you. But I've tried, and I slip into authoritarian sometimes, and I've done permissive at times, and I don't think I've ever done uninvolved, but at least I would never hope I've done uninvolved. But anyhow, authoritarian parenting is the disciplinarian. If you believe this, check this out. Do you believe children should be seen and not heard? I was raised in that household. When it comes to rules, you believe it's my way or the highway? I was raised in that household. You don't take your child's feelings into consideration. I was raised in that household. This is all very familiar to me. So there's strict discipline with little negotiation, and punishment is super common. Sometimes physical, unfortunately. Communication is mostly one way, parent to child. And rules are usually not explained, which is also true, oddly. You just don't do stuff because you're not supposed to do stuff. Parents with this style are typically less nurturing, which was, again, my case and the way I was raised. And expectations are high with limited flexibility. The other extreme is permissive parenting. Ask yourself if this is what you sound like. You don't ask your child about school or homework. You rarely know where your child is or who they are with. It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your child is? You remember those commercials, y'all? You're old enough to remember those.
I do.
Yes, right? Yeah. And it was funny because I'd be sitting watching TV with my parents, and they'd both look at me like, yeah, I know where my kid is. Okay, so you don't spend much time with your child. So communication is open, but these parents let children decide for themselves rather than giving direction. Parents in this category tend to be warm and nurturing, and expectations are typically minimal or not set by the parent at all. Uninvolved parenting, this is another not so good one. They give children a lot of freedom and generally stay out of their way. It is either due to one of three things. It's either a conscious decision, like, oh, I was so restricted as a child that I'm going to let my children be free spirits sort of thing, and that's kind of a stereotype exaggeration, but... Right. And some folks are just less interested in parenting. That would certainly describe a lot of how I was parented. Okay. And sometimes they're just unsure what to do. And I think we've all been there sometimes, like, oh, gosh, what's the right thing to do? Because we're all making this up as we go. None of us walk into parenting being experienced at it. We're just doing what we can. So you may set rules, but you rarely enforce them. You don't give out consequences very often, and you think your child will learn best with little interference from you. No particular disciplinarian style lets a child mostly do what they want, probably out of lack of information and sometimes lack of caring. And communication is limited. They offer little nurturing, too, and there are few or no expectations of the children. And then there's what has been shown over and over again to be the very best one, and that's authoritative parenting. These are parents that are reasonable and nurturing and set high, clear expectations. Children with parents who demonstrate this style tend to be self-disciplined and think for themselves. Why? Because you explain the rules and why they are what they are. It's super effective to let people know why they're doing something and explain the effect that your behavior is having on someone else and developing that empathy. We are all born with empathy, contrary to what you may have been told. Science has shown that infants tested as early as 3 months old have empathy. it's there. But there's variation in it in the first place, and second of all, it needs to be developed. So you're going to have empathy for your own quite easily,
right.
And this is often the more conservative attitude. They have tremendous empathy for their own, but none for the other. And so, if you want to develop your empathy beyond that, the child's empathy beyond that to the other, that's more progressive sort of parenting and lifestyle. And so that empathy often has to be developed because we are social animals and we naturally tend to create us and them sorts of groups. So.
Right, and if you have more in common with someone, then it can be easier to empathize. But if you have less in common, then sometimes that's a skill that needs to be developed and, figure out, okay, what do we have in common?
Yeah.
How can I empathize with this person?
Right on. So there's a lot more work in this kind of parenting. You put effort into creating and maintaining a positive relationship with your child. It's not about being friends or buddies with them. That's not what this is. It's about being that positive safety net in their lives. You explain reasons behind your rules, like I already said, and you enforce rules and give consequences that make sense. So if I don't do the thing, putting me in my room or spanking me or something, that has nothing to do with the thing, and I'm not going to learn anything from it. But if I break something and my parent requires me to pay the person for the expense of repairing it or whatever, that's a normal consequence. That makes sense. And really, consequences shouldn't be punishment so much as life lessons. And parenting folks are getting more and more away from discipline at all, and it should all be about teaching and learning and finding ways to make experiences experiences. You don't put a kid, an infant or a toddler in a room full of china and tell them to sit still. You create what's called a yes environment. Do you want to play with that? Yes, you can. Anything they can reach, they can play with. So that makes it easier. And it's not that they will never learn to not play with china and break it.
Right.
They don't have the ability to discern that at that age. And so just don't even bother. It's
setting them up for success.
Yeah,
you're setting them up for success.
Right,
so you're not putting them in situations where they're too tired or they're too hungry to be able to follow instructions if they need to. So it's our job as parents to set our kids up for success and teach them, when they do have an obstacle or a challenge that they have to deal with, it's not that things can be perfect all the time. We can't always be somewhere and they'll be well fed and they'll be well rested and they'll do what they need to do, but it's about optimizing those conditions, I think,
and listening when they're not quite right and then solving it together. When my boy was 2 years old, he was a super active kid. He was never one to sit still and do anything for any period of time. We would go home to my parents' home, and my mother had lots and lots of china at floor level. And I started to pick it up and put it up where he couldn't get at. And she said, well, haven't you taught him the meaning of the word no? God almighty. I just didn't even know where to begin with that. So that's my parenting style, which was more authoritative, and she was the authoritarian, and that's why I didn't often let her see my children. So the rules are clear and the reasons behind them are explained. Communication is frequent and appropriate to the child's level of understanding. That is one that we're constantly learning about. If a child is old enough to ask about something, they're old enough for the answer, and you just answer it with as simple terms as possible. And then if they want more information, they can chew on it and come back or whatever. But information is a fine thing to give children. And authoritative parents are nurturing. What is your parenting style? Does it fit neatly in one of those boxes? I'd be very surprised. And there are other factors in how your children turn out, not just your style of parenting. The child's personality very much has an influence on this thing. And peer influences and people outside of your home who may have had an influence on the child. There are many, many things that influence this. So any one solid parenting advice thing, no, there's no one size fits all. But these are things to consider. This particular article talked about helicopter parenting and free-range parenting. These are two new types of parenting, newish, I guess. And one is where you are authoritative, but a little bit too much in their space and a little bit too micromanaging, not letting them fall, not letting them climb the tree, whatever. I see parents who don't want their children to climb trees, and I personally don't understand that. Children should climb trees. And then there's free-range parenting, and that's where you give them a little more, a little freer boundaries than maybe most people do. To me, though, and I'm going to check in with you, Mandisa and Noelle, on this, free-range parenting is kind of how our generation was raised. And I think that a lot of the reason why you have to name it and do it now is because so many people are watching all the time. They're going to call CPS on you if you send your kid to the park unsupervised. And I don't wonder that free-range parenting should have a little more. Am I right? Am I wrong? What do y'all think? Mandisa, you want to go?
Yeah. So first, when it came to I just have to make a comment on the parents who don't want their kids climbing trees. And I do think that to an extent that should be allowed, but also the parents will have to pay those bills if the child hurts themselves.
Oh, yeah.
So I can understand a certain level of caution in not wanting them to do too much. But, and, you know, people need to think about that. And, you know, of course, it's nice to have these really, really good, you know, good progressive parenting styles. But of course, depending on, you know, and we have to consider income levels for people too, you know, that it's a privilege to be able to consider some of these parenting styles. And I think that's something that should be taken into some consideration. Not saying that they shouldn't be at all, but going back to the free range, I remember my brothers and I were what were called latchkey kids. When my mother went to work and when she went to school, my brothers and I, even though we had a large family in our neighborhood, we still, you know, when we got off the bus at school or when we came home from school, we, you know, we were by ourselves quite a bit. And it wasn't that we didn't know what to do, but there was a period of time where we had to stay at home by ourselves because our mother was busy going to school and working. And so, yeah, you know, I think that, you know, we had a bit of an intelligence level to know that there were certain people that we should not let in the house or in the apartment, and that there were certain people that we shouldn't be talking to. And it was very common where we grew up too. But, you know, it was also, you're right, there are some, you know, nowadays there are some, I think that children do need to have some sense of independence. And I think that, you know, the authoritative style can allow for that. It doesn't mean that, I mean, definitely they should know what those consequences are, but to give the ability, you know, to guide your child's ability to be able to make certain decisions. And like you said, explain what the rules are, what could happen if not, and not trying to scare them either, because there are a lot of parents who try to scare their kids into not doing stuff. And I think, explaining what, you know, could possibly happen is quite important. But I do think that, you know, it depending on the child's level of comprehension. You know, I think that there are some kids who, and then I would say that mine fall in that category. They are able to stay for a certain period of time in the house by themselves, and they'll be okay. You know, the house won't burn down. You know, nothing else will be seriously, you know, damaged, because we do try to explain things to them as much as possible, and we think that they have a good level of understanding, and that goes to, you know, not just what we're teaching them or guiding them, but also how they can comprehend and learn for themselves. And so, I think that there are some of the old ways that work and some of the old ways that don't. And I try to incorporate that as some of the older and sort of, newer styles of parenting. Of course, taking all information and evidence into consideration. We definitely are not a disciplinary household. There are consequences when the kids do something wrong or they mess up. But discipline is a last resort. It doesn't mean that it isn't frustrating, but certainly that is a last resort there. But I think there were a lot of things that we were able to do more, or we had to do on our own when we were growing up, and of course some of those things seem to be discouraged now, but I think I take some things, I take the information and see how we might be able to implement some things with also gauging where your children are, gauging where our children are. Yeah. And I think that's probably, I think a lot of the things that I experienced growing up definitely helped shape how I raised my children, and being able to take what worked and what didn't work and turn it around. And has been really helpful for me.
Paying attention. There you go. So, Mandisa, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier in what you said, but first I wanted to get Noelle's thoughts on what we just talked about here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking while you were describing the styles and how the free-range parenting and the what was the other one? The helicopter parenting. I was actually thinking about how those are newer, parenting pieces, and why those styles have kind of emerged recently, and how when I was younger, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and it was very much authoritarian parenting was mostly the thing. And so that was most of what I saw growing up. But I was able to see some examples of authoritative parenting. And I was thinking that as technology has come into play and we have all these changes with people being able to see and record things that people do all the time, I was wondering if that's kind of promoted helicopter parenting a little bit, because if you're constantly kind of worried that somebody's going to be recording you, and you're not paying attention to your kid, or, also this kind of tendency to call CPS or call the police or whatever, I can kind of see how maybe if somebody was nervous about that, that would develop. And then, of course, the free-range parenting would kind of, be a counter to that and kind of emerge in addition, or, otherwise for parents who don't want to do the helicoptering. But, we need something to call it because, like you said, otherwise people will think that it's just kind of unsupervised or whatever. So, I was thinking about how and why those would have emerged as, not necessarily different styles, but different types of reactions to the way that our society is. And so, yeah.
Right. So, Mandisa, you mentioned privilege playing a part in this, and I'd like to parse that a little bit more. I know that I can think of ways that privilege plays into that, but I want to hear from you.
Sure. So there tends to be and I'm just going to say this right out.
Right on.
There tends to be a certain way that, white parents may do things as opposed to what black parents would do, or parents who live, or people of color. And I think that, there are some communities that have a bit more access to information and a bit more access to be able to do certain things with their kids. Now, I was one of those kids who grew up not having much. Me and my brothers, we didn't have much, but, my mom kind of pushed the envelope a bit when it came to progressive, even though she was, I wouldn't even say it was disciplinary, it was abusive. But I would say that when it comes to certain things that certain kids have access to, there is often there are some kids who are disproportionately affected. Or when you look at certain communities or working class communities and what some of these kids may or may not have access to, and also considering what may be going on in their households. It doesn't mean that, I think that there are other factors that should be taken into consideration that may be socioeconomic and also institutional.
Okay. That
some parents may or may not have access to. And this is something that we just can't, we just can't ignore it. So that, so sometimes it seems like there's just like a black or white answer,
right?
Or black or white, or you should be doing this with your kid. Well, if the parent has to work, if they're a single parent and they're working 2 jobs, for example, it may be a bit more difficult for them to, to provide a certain style of parenting because they're trying to provide for their home. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that there are certain things, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be trying to be the best parents possible, but understanding that, there are certain factors that can play into why certain parents may or may not be able to do certain things with their kids. Sometimes it looks like there are some that are sitting on a mountain high judging what some parents do.
Oh, yes, we've all been judged.
And I think we should, and I think we should, I think, there are, we should be, I think there should be a conscious effort, because the average, sometimes, the average person who is looking to see how they're going to feed their kids, trying to throw all of these statistics and, information at them about what they should be doing may not necessarily help. So showing that empathy the same way we would show empathy to, we want to show empathy to our children.
Yes.
So there's some institutional factors, and I know that there's always a running joke about, like I said, what some white parents would do or what black parents.
Oh yeah,
would do.
I've heard
white parents would do the timeout.
Right. Oh, timeout I think is abusive. So yeah. So I have a question. Right, and we're both just champing at the bit to say something here to you, Mindy, and ask you questions. Go ahead, Noelle. Go. You first.
Well, I was just going to say that for me, I think that what Mandisa said is I can think of how examples of privilege in my life that have allowed me to, to change my style of parenting, because it is very hard when you've grown up with one style of parenting. Often that can be your default. Like that's what you've seen, so that's what you know, and for me, it was the authoritarian, and there were different things that happened, and I have gone to counseling and done, worked through some of the coping mechanisms that I developed due to that style of parenting, so that I can then, be a better parent and change that style of parenting for my daughter. So I've known since well before, and I don't know if we said, but I have a 7-year-old daughter. But I've known well before I was going to be a parent that I wanted to do things differently in a lot of ways than my parents. But it's very difficult to change those patterns. It's very difficult to change those emotional reactions. And if you don't have access to insurance for counseling or to some of the resources that are available, and obviously different resources work for different people, so I'm not saying that counseling is the only way to work through some of these things, but I know that having access to it for me was necessary to be able to find some different ways to parent and find some different reactions. Like if my daughter yells at me, I was yelled at and I don't react to that very well. So working through that, I think is extremely important. And the more resources that you have to do that, the easier it is. So I guess that's just kind of an example or an illustration of what Mandisa is saying. Does that make sense, I guess?
Mandisa?
Yeah, it does. And let me just, before I know you want to say something, Claire.
Let's go. I want you to talk.
I actually, I read a book that helped me a lot. It was called Toxic Parents, and I actually belong to the group on Facebook because there are a lot of adults who are still dealing with their abusive childhoods. And sometimes those abuse does cross economic lines. So there are people who were raised in affluent or very, or they've had privilege, or they've come from, they were well off and they were still abused. And so that was something that I had to realize and understand when I grew up, was that it wasn't just because I came from a working class environment that this was happening, that it does crosses racial lines, it crosses economic lines. But so I just wanted to say that does, I've been able to see that, excuse me.
Yeah, and not that it doesn't, but that, my main point, just to be clear, is that it can be easier to work through some of the traumas and change, your behaviors if you have access to, like, Facebook is great, that having access to that group, having a computer, but if you don't have access to the internet, or if you don't have access to, whatever resources that can help get you out of those patterns, then it's that much harder to turn around and parent, differently, intentionally.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough one. Oh boy, since you both have talked, I've been thinking of other things. If you're watching and you want to join this conversation or have a question or a comment, please call. I never remember the stupid phone number. 512-565. Spirit, speak to me. What's the rest of the phone number? 686-0279. Right. The reason I have trouble remembering it is because it's really similar to my phone number, and I don't want to mess it up. So 512-686-0279. Please do call. We want to hear from you. And okay, back to what y'all were saying. The privilege thing. Yeah, it takes time, it takes money, it takes resources to change the way you parent if the way you were parented was bad. And I have had to put a lot of resources into discovering the way and creating the way I wanted to parent versus how I was parented.
And I don't know if, can I just...
Go ahead.
Well, I try to avoid using like bad or good, especially with my daughter. Like, something is unhealthy or something is healthy, but, I a lot of times growing up was told, be good or be a good girl or do good or good job. And so kind of avoiding that way of classifying things that, even if you use an unhealthy style of parenting or a less healthy style of parenting, that doesn't mean, that you're bad or that, your kids are going to turn out bad or anything. It's, we just do the best that we can. Yeah.
Right. So, clearly, I think I turned out pretty okay. But I'm going to go ahead and say the way I was raised was wrong, because when I have the great privilege of having friends who are child rearing experts and parenting experts, and anytime that I would ask them, "What do I do? I'm pulling my hair out," and it was always the exact opposite of how I was parented, always. So I'm pretty clear that how I was raised was very wrong. So as far as privilege goes, let me see. How are we as people? I know the joke that you're talking about, Mandisa. I wanted to acknowledge that. There are the jokes that the comedians tell where the white parent is being so permissive. "Oh, Timmy, we talked about this. We're not going to do this, right?" And on, and no actual consequence ever comes. It's just talking and being nice and all that stuff. And it's ridiculous. That's not the best way of parenting, truly. And then the people of color comedians that I always watch, they're always talking about, just give them a smack on the butt sort of thing. And it's been shown unequivocally that that's not a good way to parent. So there's got to be something in between there, obviously, and that seems to be authoritative parenting. How do we get there?
Yeah, so I was just going to say today I was out shopping earlier, and I was in the store, and there was a Black woman who was talking to her children just horrendously. And she, said, "I'm going to beat your A if you don't stop." And that just made me cringe because, first of all, it did remind me of my childhood. And so I think, and it's almost like in many Black households, like the spanking and the beating is like a source of pride, which is which really does make me cringe. And I know it's not just I know it isn't just exclusive to the Black community, but we tend to hear it a lot, and it's there's a whole institutional aspect there that we don't have enough time to get into today. But but I do think that, as times are changing, as well as the mix, because we live in a pretty diverse neighborhood here in Fayetteville in Georgia. And there's different types of parents, and there's different types of Black parents. And I think many of them are, doing a more like authoritative, style of parenting. But then I've also seen other Black parents who have done the, uninvolved, who, they seem to not have cared at all about what their children did. And so it's an interesting mix there that we see. And I think kind of I think we do kind of get to the, we can help break that down by showing that, first of all, it isn't just exclusive to one community. That, there are certainly white parents who do a lot of the same, they employ a lot of the same abusive tactics that other, that Black parents do. And, or other, or people from other ethnicities. Yeah. And I think continuing to talk about this really does help, because I do talk with my children a lot. I don't tell them everything that I've been through, but they do know that I will tell them, I'm not feeling well right now, or I'm angry. I'll communicate with them what I'm feeling. And I also try to, I also gauge how they're feeling, and, whether or not it's the right time to discuss certain things. It doesn't cost us much to really step back and reflect.
Amen.
Even with all of this, it does not. And, just taking the time because as parents, and especially as mothers, we are often the last on the self-care list or the care list. Parents, or whether it's us, everybody seems to come before us. And that becomes very difficult when there is, a responsibility on our shoulders, and it can become frustrating. But this is why I do my best to, communicate and let my children know that, hey, this may not be the right time for me. This may not be the right time for you. So, we'll come back to it another time.
Right. So, that space to breathe instead of trying to deal with it when you're all aroused emotionally. It's just not wise. Right.
Yeah, I think our kids seeing us set those boundaries for ourselves and seeing, that's probably a big motivator for me when I do my own self-care, is because I know that my daughter is going to see that, and she's going to see me setting that example. She's going to see how I do it, and she's going to learn from me. That's how kids learn, right? From watching their parents and watching people around them. So, if anybody is kind of hesitant about the self-care, just think you're doing it for your kid. You're doing it so your kid can, that's obviously not the only reason, but, our kids will see us as mothers or as parents, and they'll see how we set boundaries, like Mandisa said, how she, shows her emotions or shares her emotions with her kids. Like, that's okay for kids.
Appropriately, right?
Yeah.
Because in my house, anger was super prevalent, but it was abusive. And my father was the only one who could be angry. And then and he was scary angry. He was terrifying. In his old age, when he, as he aged and paid attention, he realized what he had done and he apologized. And that's the other thing we can do as parents that is so important, is when you screw up, acknowledge it and apologize. It makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think pretending like we haven't screwed up is one of the, I see that as a kind of authoritarian type.
Oh, it's gaslighting
style. You know, it's like I have to be seen as the authority figure, and I need to maintain my my power. And if I apologize, that's going to make the kid see me as less authoritarian. So I cannot apologize. So I think that's really one of the examples of you know, the authoritative parenting style that that's a huge difference from authoritarian.
Right on, right on.
So, and I was thinking, did you have something you wanted to move on to, or
no? Go ahead. What one?
I wanted to talk, when you were talking about the styles at the beginning, I wanted to talk a little bit about the, what is it, uninvolved, or?
Oh, yeah, uninvolved parent.
I was thinking about that in terms, and since we're talking about kind of diversity and diverse, you know, socioeconomic statuses or areas, I really think that the uninvolved, it reminds me of, like, I have depression. So when you're depressed, especially if you're in a you know, a lower economic category, or I don't know what the best word is to use, but then you might not have as easy access to mental health treatment. So it's not just about, you know, I'm
don't care. You might not be able.
Yeah, or like I'm going to counseling just because I want to adjust my parenting style. Like there might be mental health issues. There might be physical health issues that people are trying to deal with. So I do think it makes a lot of sense not to kind of judge any of these styles as necessarily, you know, oh, parents who do that are bad. There's always mitigating factors that come into play.